There is a chapter of human history so old, so vast, and so deliberately overlooked that most people on Earth have never heard a single sentence about it. Not because it isn't remarkable, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the story is so ancient, so inconvenient to everything we were taught, and so staggeringly deep that even the scientists who study it admit they are barely touching the surface. We are talking about 50,000 years of continuous human civilization on a single continent. 50,000 years of memory, survival, adaptation, and culture, hidden in plain sight beneath the red dirt of Australia. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is a place on this planet where human beings have been living, breathing, dreaming, and remembering longer than anywhere else on Earth. And we have spent the last 2 centuries almost completely ignoring them. Let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of Australian colonial history, not 1788, not the arrival of the first fleet, not the moment British sailors looked out at a coastline they had decided to call empty. Let us go back much further than that, tens of thousands of years further, to a time when the continent of Australia looked nothing like it does today, when the seas were lower and the land was wider and human beings were making one of the most audacious journeys in the entire history of our species. Around 65,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, a group of people stood at the edge of the known world. They were in what we would now call Southeast Asia, somewhere near the islands that would eventually become Indonesia and Timor. In front of them stretched open ocean, not a river, not a lake, not a narrow strait you could almost throw a stone across. Open ocean, dozens of kilometers of dark water with no visible land on the other side, and somehow, impossibly, they crossed it. This was not an accident. The most compelling research into this migration event, particularly the work coming out of Majid Bebe Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia, confirms that humans were present on the continent at least 65,000 years ago. Some researchers push that date back even further, toward 80,000 years. Either number rewrites everything we thought we knew about human migration, about the capacity of ancient people, about what was and was not possible with the technology of the Paleolithic world. Because here is what that crossing required. It required boats, or at the very minimum, watercraft. Rafts of some kind, constructed deliberately, capable of surviving open ocean. It required navigation, not following a coastline, not drifting with a current and getting lucky, but intentional movement across water with no visible destination. It required planning, coordination, enough food and water to survive the crossing, enough knowledge of the sea to attempt it at all. And it required something that most accounts of ancient humanity have been slow to grant our ancestors: intelligence. Sophisticated, strategic, forward-thinking intelligence. The people who crossed that ocean 65,000 years ago were not primitive. They were not shuffling half-formed creatures dragging their knuckles through the sand. They were fully human in every sense that matters. They could speak, they could plan, they could build, they could dream. They looked up at the same stars we look at today, and they read them like a map. And when they landed on the northern shores of what would become Australia, they found something extraordinary waiting for them, a continent of staggering biological richness, unlike anything anywhere else on Earth. Megafauna that had never learned to fear a human being, forests of impossible variety. River systems sprawling across a landscape that was, at that time, greener and wetter than the continent we recognize today. And a sky above them that was, at night, so full of stars, it must have seemed like the universe itself was reaching down to greet them. They did not call the land Australia. That name would come much later, imposed by people who arrived from halfway around the world. They had their own names for the rivers and the ranges and the redstone country and the coastal forests. They had names for the stars and the seasons and the animals that moved through the dark. And those names and the stories attached to them would survive in some form for the next 50 or 60,000 years, making them the oldest continuous oral tradition on the planet. Let us sit with that number for a moment. 50,000 years. To understand how long that is, consider this. The oldest pyramid in Egypt is about 4,600 years old. The great city of Rome, at the height of its power, was roughly 2,000 years ago. The writing system we use today, the alphabet, in its earliest recognizable form, is perhaps 5,000 years old. Agriculture, the revolution that supposedly gave rise to civilization, began roughly 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. Now, take all of that. Every pyramid, every empire, every written word, every planted field, every city wall and sailing ship and bronze sword and marble column. Stack all of it on top of each other chronologically. You have, at most, 12,000 years of what we typically call recorded human civilization. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have been continuously present on their continent for at least 4 times that long, possibly 5 times. Their culture, their knowledge systems, their languages, their stories, their relationship with the land extend back into a depth of time that the word ancient does not adequately describe. We need a different word. We need a different way of thinking entirely. And yet somehow, for much of the last 2 centuries, the dominant story of Australian history has begun in 1788, as if nothing of consequence happened before that date, as if the continent was simply waiting, empty and purposeless, for someone to come along and name it properly. This is not just a historical oversight. It is one of the most remarkable acts of collective forgetting in the history of modern civilization. So, what actually happened during those 50,000 years? What did people do? How did they live? What did they discover? What did they build? Not in stone and mortar, but in knowledge and culture and adaptation. What did they know about the land beneath their feet and the sky above their heads and the deep time of their own history? These are the questions this story is going to try to answer. And the answers, the ones that researchers and archaeologists and linguists and astronomers are slowly piecing together from the evidence that survived, are more astonishing than most people imagine. Let us begin with the land itself. Because to understand what happened during those lost 50,000 years, you first have to understand what Australia was and what it became during that period. When the first people arrived on the northern coast of Australia, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago, the continent they stepped onto was not the Australia of today. The sea level was dramatically lower. The shallow waters between what is now Australia and New Guinea were land. The Torres Strait, the body of water that today separates Australia from Papua New Guinea, did not exist. The 2 land masses were connected, forming a single vast continent that researchers sometimes call Sahul. This supercontinent was enormous, stretching from near the equator down into the high latitudes of the southern hemisphere, from tropical rainforest in the north to temperate forest in the south and east, from arid interior to wet coastal margins. The people who first arrived in this landscape encountered animals that existed nowhere else on Earth. Diprotodon, a wombat-like creature the size of a rhinoceros, the largest marsupial that ever lived. Procoptodon, a short-faced kangaroo standing nearly 3 meters tall. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, a predator whose bite force exceeded that of any living big cat today. Giant emus and giant wombats and enormous snakes and freshwater crocodilians that would make modern saltwater crocodiles look modest. This was a world of giants, a megafauna assemblage that had been evolving in isolation for tens of millions of years, producing creatures of extraordinary size and strangeness that had never encountered a human being. For a long time, the assumption was that the arrival of humans and the extinction of these megafauna were directly connected. That the first Australians, finding these animals completely unafraid of human hunters, simply hunted them to extinction. A blitzkrieg of human predation, wiping out tens of thousands of years of evolutionary history in what would, geologically speaking, amount to the blink of an eye. But the evidence for this straightforward story has always been complicated, because the megafauna extinctions were not immediate. They happened over a long period, and the more researchers look at the archaeological record, the more complicated the picture becomes. There is evidence that humans and megafauna coexisted on the Australian continent for a substantial period of time. There are sites where both human artifacts and megafauna remains appear together in the same sediment layers, suggesting not instant annihilation, but a much longer and more complex interaction. There is also the matter of climate. Australia, during the period of human arrival and the following tens of thousands of years, was not climatically stable. The continent went through cycles of increasing aridity as the last ice age deepened and then eventually retreated. Water sources that had been reliable became seasonal. Vegetation that had supported large herbivores shrank. The landscape changed dramatically. And when the landscape changes dramatically, the creatures adapted to the previous version of that landscape face severe pressure. The honest answer about what happened to Australia's megafauna is that we still do not know with certainty. It was probably some combination of human hunting, human use of fire to modify the landscape, and severe climate change working together over thousands of years to gradually reduce and eventually eliminate the populations of these giant animals. What is increasingly clear is that the story cannot be reduced to simple human greed and overhunting. It was more complex than that. It was a convergence of pressures, the kind that happens when a new and highly capable species arrives in an ecosystem that had never adapted to their particular intelligence. And speaking of fire, this is where the Australian story begins to get genuinely extraordinary. Because one of the most significant things that happened during those 50,000 years, one of the things that most shaped the Australian continent as it exists today, was fire. Not accidental fire, not fire that happened to people. Fire that people used deliberately, systematically, and with a sophisticated ecological understanding that modern land managers are only beginning to appreciate. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia practiced what researchers now call fire stick farming, the systematic use of controlled burns to manage the landscape. These were not random acts of pyromaniac destruction. They were carefully planned, seasonally timed, ecologically calibrated burns designed to achieve specific outcomes, to encourage new growth of certain plants that attracted game animals, to clear pathways through dense vegetation, to reduce the fuel load that might otherwise accumulate and lead to catastrophic uncontrolled fires, to maintain the mosaic of different vegetation types that supported the enormous biodiversity of the continent. This practice transformed Australia, not overnight and not dramatically in any single generation, but over thousands of years. The cumulative effect of human fire management on the Australian landscape was profound. The open grasslands of inland Australia, the grassy woodlands that characterize much of the continent, the patterns of vegetation that struck European explorers as almost park-like in their open quality. These were not natural landscapes in any simple sense. They were, at least in part, the product of tens of thousands of years of human management. Australia's landscape had been sculpted by human hands, but those hands used fire instead of plows, and the sculpting happened across millennia instead of years. This is a concept that challenges some very deeply held assumptions about what counts as civilization, what counts as environmental modification, what counts as a managed landscape. When European settlers arrived in Australia in the late 18th century, they saw a continent that seemed to them wild and unmanaged. They did not recognize the fire-managed landscapes around them as managed at all because the management looked nothing like anything they were familiar with. There were no fences, there were no plowed fields, there were no irrigation channels or drained swamps or planted orchards. But there was fire, carefully, systematically, intelligently applied fire, and behind it, tens of thousands of years of accumulated ecological knowledge about how the Australian landscape worked and what it needed. When Aboriginal Australians were removed from their traditional lands through the processes of colonization, and when the practice of fire stick farming was suppressed or simply became impossible to continue, something interesting happened to the Australian landscape. It began to change, vegetation patterns shifted, the fuel loads that the traditional burns had been keeping in check began to accumulate. And eventually, in ways that researchers and ecologists and fire managers are still working to understand and address, the fire regime that had shaped Australia for tens of thousands of years was disrupted in ways that continue to have consequences today. Now, let us talk about language, because one of the most remarkable things about Australia's long human history is what it preserved in language, and what that language tells us about the depth and complexity of the culture that used it. Before European colonization, there were somewhere between 200 and 300 distinct languages spoken across the Australian continent. Not dialects, languages, mutually unintelligible, grammatically distinct, phonologically diverse language systems that had evolved independently over thousands of years. Some shared distant ancestry, many did not. Together, they represented one of the most linguistically diverse regions on Earth, comparable in density of distinct languages to parts of New Guinea and the Amazon basin. Most of these languages are now gone. The process of colonization, which included in some places the deliberate punishment of children for speaking their native languages, wiped out the majority of Australia's linguistic heritage within a few generations. Today, roughly a dozen or so Aboriginal languages are still spoken by significant numbers of people. Most others survive only in historical records, in the memories of very old speakers, in the work of linguists who recorded what they could before the last speakers died or not at all. But what survived and what researchers have been able to reconstruct and analyze tells an extraordinary story, because some of these languages contain within them features and structures that appear to preserve very old knowledge. Knowledge about the landscape, about astronomical events, about geological processes that happened so long ago that the idea of people having witnessed them and preserved the memory and language seems almost impossible. And yet the evidence is there. Let us talk about some specific examples because they are genuinely astonishing. The Gunditjmara people of southwestern Victoria have oral traditions about a time when the landscape of their country was dramatically different, about volcanic activity, about lava flows, about a formation of the waterways and wetlands that characterize their country today. The thing is, geological research confirms that there was indeed volcanic activity in southwestern Victoria. Lava flows that created the landscape features described in the oral traditions. And those lava flows happened, according to the geological record, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago. If the Gunditjmara oral traditions genuinely preserve a memory of that volcanic activity, that memory has been passed down through spoken language from generation to generation for tens of thousands of years. That is not just remarkable. That is something for which we do not really have adequate words. The Klamath people of Oregon in the United States have an oral tradition about a great mountain that fell into itself and became a lake. Their story describes the event in detail, including the darkness and the fire and the collapse. Geologists investigating the formation of Crater Lake in Oregon, which was indeed formed by the catastrophic collapse of a volcanic mountain, have calculated that the eruption and collapse happened approximately 7,700 years ago. The Klamath oral tradition appears to be a memory of that event, 7,700 years old, preserved in story. Now, imagine what might be preserved in the oral traditions of a people who have been continuously present on their continent for 65,000 years, who have generation after generation passed down stories and knowledge and observations about their landscape, their sky, their ecology, their history. The depth of what might be encoded in those traditions is genuinely staggering to contemplate. Researchers working in Australia have begun to take seriously the idea that Aboriginal oral traditions may preserve genuine memories of events that happened in deep time. Events like the flooding of the continental shelf as sea levels rose after the last ice age. The Australian coastline today is dramatically different from the coastline that existed 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower. Vast areas of what is now shallow continental shelf were dry land. Places where people lived, where communities existed, where rivers ran to the sea. All of that was drowned by rising waters as the ice age ended and the glaciers melted. And some Aboriginal oral traditions appear to describe this flooding. Stories of a time when the land extended much further than it does today, when the sea was far away, when there were rivers and lakes in places now covered by ocean. Stories that describe the gradual encroachment of the sea, the flooding of known landscapes, the loss of lands that communities had inhabited. Researchers have mapped some of these traditions against the geological record of sea level rise and found striking correspondences. The locations described in the stories match places that were indeed above water during the last ice age and that are now submerged. The timing, where it can be estimated, matches the geological timeline of when specific areas were flooded. If this interpretation is correct, then some Aboriginal oral traditions are preserving memories of events that happened more than 10,000 years ago. Memories of a different world, a different coastline, a different geography. Memories that have survived not in stone tablets or clay records or papyrus scrolls, but in the living memory of a people passed from mouth to ear for hundreds of generations. This is the oldest archive in human history, and for most of the last 2 centuries, we barely knew it existed. Let us talk about the night sky, because another remarkable dimension of Aboriginal Australian knowledge involves astronomy, and it is, in its own way, as extraordinary as anything else we have discussed. Most people, when they think of ancient astronomy, think of the great stone monuments of Europe and the Middle East, Stonehenge aligned to the solstice, the pyramids oriented to specific stars, the temples of Karnak, built to catch the light of the rising sun on particular days of the year. These monuments represent genuine astronomical knowledge, encoded in stone, preserved for millennia, and they are impressive, but they are, at most, a few thousand years old, and they represent astronomical observations made over perhaps a few hundred years at most before the monuments were constructed. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Aboriginal Australian traditions is, in some respects, far more extensive and far older, because for 65,000 years, people living in the Southern Hemisphere, in some of the darkest skies in the world, far from any major light sources, watched the night sky. They watched it every night. They told stories about it. They organized their calendars around it. They navigated by it. They encoded knowledge about it in traditions that were passed down across countless generations. The result was a body of astronomical knowledge that researchers are only beginning to appreciate. And some of what has been found in that knowledge is genuinely surprising. Traditional Aboriginal astronomical knowledge includes detailed observations of the movements of stars, planets, and the moon across the sky throughout the year. It includes understanding of the relationship between astronomical events and seasonal changes on the ground. The appearance of certain stars or constellations signals the arrival of certain food sources. The position of the Pleiades, for example, known in some traditions as the Seven Sisters, was used to mark specific seasons and specific activities. But there is something even more distinctive about Aboriginal astronomy, something that has no real parallel in any other astronomical tradition in the world. The Aboriginal astronomical traditions of Australia include what researchers now call dark constellation astronomy, the systematic identification of shapes and figures not in the stars themselves, but in the dark patches of the Milky Way, in the clouds of interstellar dust that block the light of stars behind them, creating dark shapes against the bright band of the galaxy. You are probably familiar with the concept of dot-to-dot constellations, Orion the Hunter, the Big Dipper, Scorpius the Scorpion. These are shapes traced between bright stars, but Aboriginal Australian astronomical traditions also identified shapes in the dark patches between and around the bright stars of the Milky Way. The emu in the sky, for example, is a shape traced not in stars, but in the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way. When the emu is in the right position in the sky, when the dark shape of the emu appears to be lying down, emus on the ground will be sitting on their nests, incubating their eggs. This is a genuine ecological observation encoded in astronomical knowledge. The position of the dark constellation provides a precise seasonal signal for a specific ecological event. This is sophisticated. This is the integration of astronomical observation with ecological knowledge in a way that is both elegant and practically useful. And it is knowledge that could only have been developed through sustained, systematic observation of the sky over a very long period of time, Researchers have also found evidence that some Aboriginal traditions preserve knowledge of astronomical events that are extraordinarily rare, events that happen on timescales of centuries or millennia. There are traditions that appear to describe meteor impacts, perhaps including the Henbury craters in the Northern Territory, which were formed by a meteorite impact that occurred approximately 4,200 years ago. There are traditions that appear to describe unusual solar phenomena. There are, in some accounts, traditions that appear to preserve observations of variable stars, stars that change in brightness over time, including some that are only visible to the naked eye during their brightest phases. All of this represents accumulated observational data that, in any other context, we would recognize as a scientific tradition. A systematic, multi-generational program of observation, recording, and transmission of knowledge about the natural world. The format is different. There are no stone tablets, no papyrus scrolls, no clay tablets with cuneiform. The format is story and song and ceremony and map, but the knowledge itself is real, and in many cases it is accurate, and the accumulation of it over tens of thousands of years represents one of the most sustained scientific traditions in human history. Let us now turn to something that may be even more contentious in some respects, and that is the question of what Aboriginal Australians built. Because when we talk about ancient civilizations, we tend to think in terms of monuments, pyramids, temples, cities, walls. We measure civilization in stone. And for a long time, the absence of these kinds of structures in Australia was taken as evidence that Aboriginal culture was somehow simpler, less developed, less civilized than the cultures of other parts of the world. This argument is, in multiple respects, profoundly wrong. But unpacking why it is wrong requires thinking carefully about what constitutes a built environment, and what constitutes technology, and what constitutes complexity. Consider first the aquaculture systems of Western Victoria, because this is a case where the physical evidence of sophisticated engineering has survived, and it is genuinely remarkable. The Gonditjmara people of southwestern Victoria built, over a period of several thousand years, an elaborate system of stone channels, weirs, and traps designed to manage the populations of eels in the wetlands of their country. These are not simple fish traps thrown together in a season. These are engineered landscape modifications requiring coordination of labor, planning across time, and a detailed understanding of both hydraulic principles and eel ecology. The system at Buj Bim, which UNESCO recognized as a World Heritage Site in 2019, is thought to be at least 6,600 years old, making it one of the oldest aquaculture systems in the world, possibly the oldest. The Gunditjmara built these systems, tended them, modified them over generations, and used them to support a population that, in terms of sedentism and resource management, looked nothing like what people typically imagine when they think of hunter-gatherers. Because here is something important to understand about the 50,000 years of Australian prehistory. The category of hunter-gatherer, which is often used as a shorthand for simple and nomadic and pre-civilization, does not adequately describe the range of life ways that Aboriginal Australians practiced. Some groups were indeed highly mobile, following the seasonal movements of resources across the landscape. But others were substantially more sedentary, living in fixed locations for extended periods, managing the resources of their country in ways that sustained large populations. The people who built and maintained the Buj Bim aquaculture system were not wandering through the landscape living hand to mouth. They were resident managers of a sophisticated food production system, living in substantial permanent or semi-permanent structures, accumulating resources, and sustaining communities of considerable size. The Budge BIM system is not unique. Across Australia, researchers working with Aboriginal communities and applying new archaeological techniques to landscapes that were previously dismissed as unmodified have found evidence of human management on a scale that challenges old assumptions. Seed grinding technologies in Australia have now been dated to as far back as 30,000 years ago, making Australian people some of the first in the world to process grain, not to cultivate it in the agricultural sense, but to systematically harvest, process, and store wild seeds. The technology involved is genuinely sophisticated, and the fact that it was being practiced in Australia at the height of the last ice age, when much of Europe was still dealing with glaciers, is remarkable. There are also the stone arrangements. Across the Australian continent, Aboriginal people created arrangements of stones that served multiple purposes, from ceremonial and astronomical to territorial and navigational. Some of these arrangements are ancient, some mark specific features of the landscape. Some appear to encode information about routes through country, water sources, seasonal food availability. They are not pyramids, they are not Stonehenge, but they are deliberate, meaningful modifications of the landscape, created with intention and purpose, and in some cases maintained and added to over generations. And then there are the grinding grooves. Scattered across rock outcrops throughout Australia, particularly near watercourses, are elongated grooves ground into the surface of sandstone by the repeated sharpening of stone axes. Some of these grooves are extraordinarily ancient. The oldest known ground edge axe technology in the world comes from Australia, dated to at least 49,000 years ago. Ground edge tools represent a significant technological advance over simple flaked stone tools, requiring a different understanding of stone properties and a different set of manufacturing techniques. And Australian people were making them, in some cases, before any other people on Earth. This matters because ground edge tool technology appears in other parts of the world much later. In Europe, it appears during the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 years ago, associated with the spread of agriculture. In Australia, it was being practiced tens of thousands of years before that. Australian people were technological innovators. They were developing sophisticated tool technologies independently from their own materials in response to their own ecological needs. The image of a Stone Age Australia simply waiting in technological stasis for the rest of the world to catch up is not merely wrong. It is the precise opposite of the truth. Let us pause here and think about why so much of this has been overlooked, minimized, or outright dismissed for so long. Because the question of how and why the 50,000 years of Australian history became the 50,000 years that most of the world forgot is not a neutral question. It is deeply entangled with the history of colonialism, race, and the intellectual frameworks that European civilization used to organize and justify its expansion across the globe. When the British arrived in Australia in 1788, they came armed not just with guns and ships, but with a set of ideas. Ideas about civilization and primitiveness, about property and land ownership, about history and progress. These ideas told them, very conveniently, that the Aboriginal people of Australia were at the bottom of a hierarchy of human development, that they were primitive, prehistorical, unchanging, that they had not improved their land and therefore had no right to it, that their culture was simple and their technology rudimentary and their history essentially non-existent. This was not an honest assessment of the evidence. The evidence, even as it was available in the 18th century, contradicted this picture in multiple ways. But it was a picture that served a purpose. It justified dispossession. It made colonization seem like progress rather than theft. It allowed the settlers and the colonial government to declare Australia terra nullius, land belonging to no one, and proceed on that basis despite the overwhelming evidence that the continent was inhabited by people with complex cultures, sophisticated knowledge systems, and tens of thousands of years of continuous presence. The intellectual framework that placed Aboriginal Australians at the bottom of a developmental hierarchy was, to put it plainly, a lie. But it was a lie told with such conviction and repeated so often and embedded so deeply in the institutions of European intellectual life, from universities to museums to government offices, that it functioned as truth for most of 2 centuries. And one of the consequences of that lie was the systematic neglect and dismissal of Aboriginal history itself. If Aboriginal people were prehistoric, pre-civilizational, then by definition they had no history worth studying. They were a curiosity, an anthropological specimen, a living relic of an earlier stage of human development, not people with a history stretching back 50,000 years, not people with sophisticated knowledge systems and complex social structures and rich intellectual traditions, just primitives. This is why the 50,000 years became lost, not because the evidence was not there, but because the intellectual framework that dominated Australian and global scholarship for 2 centuries was not capable of seeing it. The situation is changing, slowly, incompletely, but genuinely changing. Archaeologists, linguists, ecologists, astronomers, and historians are taking the depth and complexity of Aboriginal Australian history seriously in ways that were simply not possible within the older intellectual framework. New dating techniques, new analytical methods, new willingness to take seriously the knowledge preserved in Aboriginal traditions themselves, and new collaborations between researchers and Aboriginal communities are producing a revolution in understanding. And what that revolution is revealing is, as I said at the beginning, more astonishing than most people imagine. Let us talk about the social structures of Aboriginal Australia, because this is another area where old assumptions have been seriously challenged. For a long time, the image of Aboriginal social organisation was one of small, loosely organised bands, kinship groups wandering through the landscape with no fixed territorial arrangements, no complex political organisation, no systems of governance beyond the authority of elders in immediate family groups. This picture was never entirely accurate, but it has been substantially revised. What researchers have come to appreciate is that Aboriginal social organisation was, in many parts of the continent, extraordinarily complex. Complex in ways that operated at multiple scales simultaneously. At the local level, the family group or band. At the regional level, the language group or clan. And at the continental level, the vast networks of ceremony, trade, and social obligation that connected communities across enormous distances. Consider the trade networks. Before European contact, trade goods were moving across the Australian continent through chains of exchange that spanned hundreds or thousands of kilometres. Ochre, the red pigment that appears so frequently in Aboriginal rock art and ritual contexts was traded from specific quarry sites across enormous distances. Certain types of stone for toolmaking were similarly traded far from their sources. Shells from coastal communities ended up in the collections of people living far inland. These are not the movements of isolated bands with no knowledge of or connection to each other. These are the traces of a continent-wide economic network, operating through well-established channels of exchange. And connected to those trade networks were what researchers call songlines, or dreaming tracks. These are one of the most remarkable features of Aboriginal cultural geography, and they are also one of the most frequently misunderstood. Songlines are, at one level, routes through the landscape. They follow the paths of ancestral beings who, in the beginning of time, according to Aboriginal cosmology, moved through the world singing things into existence. Rivers, mountains, plains, rock formations, waterholes. All of these features of the landscape were created by the movements and songs of ancestral beings in a period called the dreaming, or in some languages Chukurpa or Alkeringa. The landscape of Australia is, in this understanding, not simply a physical geography. It is a sacred geography, imbued with meaning, connected by the paths of ancestral beings, alive with significance. But songlines are also, at a more practical level, navigation systems. They encode detailed geographical information in a form that can be transmitted and remembered through song, story, and ceremony. The songs that describe a particular songline encode information about landmarks, water sources, distances, and directions. A person who knows the songs can navigate across country they have never physically visited because the songs tell them where to go, what to look for, how to find water in dry country. This is information technology, not silicon chips and digital signals, but knowledge encoded in rhythm and melody and story and transmitted across generations through performance. The scale of the songline network is remarkable. Some songlines extend for thousands of kilometers across the continent, connecting coastal communities to desert communities to mountain communities to river communities. These extended routes were maintained by the different communities through whose country they passed. Each community knew the section of the song that related to their own country, and the full song, the full route, was complete only when all the sections were sung together. This created a system of mutual dependency and connection that helped maintain peaceful relationships between communities across vast distances. This is not a simple social structure. This is a complex, continent-wide network of relationships, knowledge, and obligation maintained through cultural practices that have no real parallel anywhere else in the world. And it operated in one form or another for tens of thousands of years. Let us go deeper into the dreaming because it is central to understanding Aboriginal Australian culture. And it is also one of the most frequently mischaracterized aspects of that culture in popular accounts. The dreaming, or the dream time as it is sometimes called in English translations, is not a mythology in the sense of a set of stories that people understand to be fictional or metaphorical. It is not equivalent to the Greek myths or the Norse sagas, entertainments, or philosophical allegories. It is better understood as a cosmological and ontological framework, a way of understanding the nature of reality, time, and existence that is fundamentally different from the Western frameworks that most of us were raised in. In the dreaming, time does not work the way it does in Western cosmology. The creation events of the dreaming are not distant historical events that happened once in the past and are now over. They are ongoing. The ancestral beings who created the landscape are not dead and gone. Their presence persists in the land itself, in the features of the landscape, in the continuing practices of ceremony and song and storytelling that maintain the connection between the living and the ancestral. The past is not past in the way Western thinking tends to understand it. It is present, accessible, alive in the land, and in the practices that connect people to the land. This is a sophisticated philosophical position. It represents a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between time, land, knowledge, and human existence. And it is one that has proven remarkably resilient. The dreaming is not a fossil of ancient thinking preserved in amber. It is a living intellectual tradition that has continued to develop and respond to new circumstances across 65,000 years of continuous cultural life. One of the things that makes it so resilient is its relationship to place. The stories and songs of the dreaming are tied to specific locations in the landscape, specific rock formations, specific water holes, specific trees, specific hillsides are the settings for specific stories, the homes of specific ancestral beings, the locations where specific ceremonies must be performed. This means that the knowledge encoded in the dreaming is, in a very real sense, backed up by the landscape itself. You cannot forget a story if the landscape constantly reminds you of it. The rocks are memory, the water holes are memory, the paths between them are memory. This is one of the reasons that dispossession from land was so devastating to Aboriginal culture in ways that go beyond the physical. When people were removed from their country, they were removed from the mnemonic system that their culture had used for tens of thousands of years to preserve its knowledge. The land was not just a place to live, it was a library, and the library was taken away. Now, let us consider what the physical evidence, the archaeological record, tells us about life in Australia across those 50,000 years. Because while so much of the focus in thinking about Aboriginal history has been on the intangible, on culture and knowledge and social organisation, there is also a substantial and growing physical record that tells a story of its own. The rock art of Australia is one of the great treasures of world cultural heritage, and it is one of the oldest continuous artistic traditions on the planet. There are rock art sites across the continent, from the Kimberley in the northwest to Kakadu in the north to the desert centre, to the Pilbara to the caves and shelters of the southeast and southwest. And collectively, they represent a visual record of human experience in Australia across a time span that dwarfs any other continuous artistic tradition in the world. The oldest definitively dated rock art in Australia is somewhere around 17,000 years old, but there are strong reasons to believe that the tradition extends much further back. In some locations, the density and layering of images suggests continuous use of a site across enormous periods of time. Images painted over other images, figures superimposed on figures, representing the accumulation of visits and additions across countless generations. The subjects of the rock art are diverse. Animals, some extinct and some still living. Human figures engaged in ceremonies, in dance, in hunting. Ancestral beings represented in forms that combine human and animal characteristics. Abstract geometric forms whose meaning may be fully understood only by those initiated into the relevant ceremonial traditions. In some sites, there are depictions of animals that are now extinct, animals that survived in Australia until humans had been on the continent for many thousands of years, but that were eventually gone. These images are not just art. They are records of encounters with creatures that modern humans have only seen as fossils. Wandjina figures in the Kimberley, enormous painted faces with large eyes and no mouths, represent one of the most striking artistic traditions in the world. They are ancient and they continue to be repainted and maintained by the traditional owners of those sites to this day, making them part of a continuous artistic tradition that has operated without interruption across an extraordinary span of time. The exact age of the oldest Wandjina figures is debated, but some researchers place them in the range of several thousand years, while the tradition of painting and repainting them is ongoing. The Bradshaw figures, known to the Gwian people of the Kimberley as Gwian, are some of the most elegant and detailed prehistoric rock art figures found anywhere in the world. Slender, sophisticated human figures in dynamic poses, depicted with elaborate headdresses and clothing and ornamentation. They represent a tradition of extraordinary artistic sophistication, and their age is, among certain researchers, a subject of considerable controversy. Some estimates place them at 17,000 years or older, which would make them among the oldest figurative art in the world. The debate about the age of Australian rock art is ongoing, and in some cases it intersects with broader debates about the timing of artistic and cognitive development in our species. Because one of the standard narratives about human evolution has been that a kind of creative explosion happened roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, associated with the appearance of sophisticated art and symbolic behavior in the archaeological record of Europe. This narrative has been questioned on multiple grounds, not least because it seems to reflect the research priorities of European and Western scholars more than it reflects the actual distribution of early symbolic behavior in the archaeological record globally. Evidence from Africa, including ochre use and shell beads, dated to over 100,000 years ago, strongly suggests that symbolic behavior and the cognitive capacity that underlies it are much older than the European Upper Paleolithic explosion narrative allows. And evidence from Australia fits into this broader reorientation of the story. If the first Australians crossed an open ocean 65,000 years ago, they were doing something that required planning, coordination, and the capacity for abstract thought. They were not cognitively pre-artistic. They were fully modern humans in every meaningful cognitive sense from the moment they set foot on Australian shores. Let us talk about the people themselves, about what they looked like, how they lived, what their physical lives were like across those 50,000 years. Because there is a human story here that often gets lost in the more abstract discussions of culture and knowledge. The Aboriginal people of Australia were, over those 50,000 years, extraordinarily diverse. Not just culturally and linguistically, but physically. The continent is enormous, stretching across multiple climate zones, from tropical to temperate, from coastal to desert. The populations that adapted to these different environments over tens of thousands of years developed physical characteristics appropriate to their local conditions. The people of the tropical north looked different from the people of the temperate southeast. The people of the central desert had physical adaptations to extreme heat and aridity that differed from those of the coastal people, and yet they were all human, all intelligent, all culturally sophisticated, all members of a broadly connected continental civilization that expressed itself in hundreds of different local forms. The diversity of Aboriginal Australia was not a sign of fragmentation or lack of connection. It was a sign of the richness of human adaptation to an extraordinarily varied set of environments over an extraordinarily long period of time. The physical lives of most Aboriginal Australians across most of the continent involve substantial amounts of walking. The movement across country that was characteristic of many groups was not aimless wandering. It was purposeful navigation through a known landscape, following known routes between known resources at known times of the seasonal calendar. A family group moving through their country was following a pattern of movement that had been refined over generations, visiting specific locations at specific times of year to take advantage of specific resources that would be available at those locations at those times. This kind of mobile land management requires detailed knowledge of the landscape and its resources. It requires the ability to predict where food will be available and when. It requires understanding of seasonal patterns, of animal behavior, of plant phenology, of water availability. It is not random. It is highly organized, highly knowledge-intensive activity that looks from the outside like simple wandering, but is actually a sophisticated ecological management system. The diet of most Aboriginal Australians was, by modern nutritional standards, extraordinarily varied and well balanced. Studies of the diets of Aboriginal communities that maintain traditional food practices into the modern era have consistently found them to be rich in a diversity of nutrients, combining animal foods with a wide variety of plant foods in proportions that varied by season and region, but that generally provided excellent nutrition. This dietary richness was not accidental. It was a product of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about what to eat, when, how to prepare it, and how to combine different foods to meet the body's needs. Aboriginal Australians knew things about nutrition that the European settlers who arrived in 1788 had never dreamed of. The settlers brought with them diseases and livestock and seeds and tools. They brought certainty about their own cultural superiority, and they proceeded to suffer enormously from nutritional deficiencies that the people whose land they were taking would never have experienced. Scurvy, rickets, the diseases of nutritional deficiency that plagued European colonial settlements around the world were vanishingly rare in Aboriginal Australian communities that maintained traditional dietary practices because they knew what to eat. They had known for tens of thousands of years. Now, let us address something that sometimes comes up when people begin to seriously engage with the question of Australian prehistory, the question of contact, of whether the Aboriginal Australians of deep prehistory had contact with other parts of the world, whether the Australian continent was as isolated as it appears from the standard maps. The short answer is that Australian prehistory was less isolated than the standard accounts suggest. There is good evidence of contact between Australia and the peoples of New Guinea and the islands of Southeast Asia across the period of Australian prehistory. The presence of the dingo, the wild dog of Australia, is one example. Dingoes are not native to Australia in the sense of having evolved there. They arrived with humans from Southeast Asia, probably within the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. This means that within the last few thousand years, there were contacts between Australia and Southeast Asia, significant enough to involve the transfer of domestic animals. Genetic studies of Aboriginal Australians have also found traces of genetic admixture from South Asian populations dating to roughly 4,000 years ago, suggesting a period of contact and gene flow between Australia and populations from the Indian subcontinent or intermediary islands during that period. The nature of this contact is not fully understood. It may have involved small groups of traders or voyagers making occasional contact with northern Australian communities. It may have been more extensive, but it is evidence that the Australian continent, even in deep prehistory, was not entirely cut off from the broader world. There is also the question of Macassan contact, which is somewhat better documented. For centuries before European colonization, traders from the area of Makassar in what is now Indonesia made seasonal voyages to the northern coast of Australia to harvest sea cucumber, known as trepang, for sale to Chinese markets. These voyages brought Aboriginal Australians in northern coastal areas into contact with Macassan culture, trade goods, language, and people. The traces of this contact are visible in Aboriginal rock art, in loan words in some northern Australian languages, and in oral traditions that specifically reference the Macassan visitors and their boats. This is not a trivial contact. It lasted for centuries, perhaps longer, and it represents a relationship between Aboriginal Australians and Southeast Asian traders that was complex, negotiated, and mutually beneficial in various respects. Not a simple encounter between a sophisticated maritime culture and passive primitives, but an actual trade relationship between peoples. But none of this diminishes the fundamental story of Australian prehistory, the story of a people who arrived on a continent 65,000 years ago and built over the following millennia one of the most diverse, sophisticated, and enduring cultures in the history of our species. A culture that developed technologies of fire management that transformed the landscape of a continent. A culture that preserved in living oral tradition memories of events that happened tens of thousands of years ago. A culture that built in Western Victoria one of the oldest aquaculture systems in the world. A culture that developed the oldest seed grinding technology known to exist. A culture that practiced sophisticated astronomical observation for tens of thousands of years and encoded that knowledge in a tradition of dark constellation astronomy that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. Let us now turn to the question of what happened to this civilization when the world arrived at its door. Because that story, the story of the last 250 years, is inextricable from the story of the preceding 50,000. And it cannot be told honestly without confronting some very difficult truths. When the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay in January of 1788, there were between 300,000 and 1 million Aboriginal Australians living on the continent. The range in the estimate reflects the genuine uncertainty of the historical record, not a suggestion that the population was necessarily small. The most careful analyses tend toward the higher end of that range. 1 million people, organized into hundreds of distinct language groups and cultural communities, living across a continent of nearly 8 million square kilometers, managing its resources and its landscapes according to systems of knowledge accumulated over 50,000 years. Within a century of European arrival, the Aboriginal population had been reduced by somewhere between 50 and 90%, depending on the region. The causes were multiple and in many cases catastrophically rapid. Disease was the first and in many places the most devastating. The Aboriginal population had been isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for 65,000 years. They had no immunity to measles, to smallpox, to influenza, to the range of infectious diseases that had been circulating through the interconnected populations of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas for thousands of years. When these diseases arrived in Australia, they moved through populations with no resistance like wildfire through dry grass. Smallpox struck the Aboriginal population around Sydney within 2 years of European settlement. It moved faster than the settlers themselves, spreading through communities along trade and communication networks to kill people who had never seen a European face. By the time Europeans arrived in some regions of the continent, the population had already been devastated by diseases that had traveled ahead of them. The death toll from disease alone was, in some areas, catastrophic. In some communities, 70, 80, 90% mortality within a generation. For a culture that depended on the transmission of knowledge through living people, through elders, through ceremony and song and story, this level of mortality was not just a human tragedy, it was a cultural catastrophe of the first order. The deaths of elders meant the deaths of knowledge. Languages died with their last speakers. Ceremonies that had been performed continuously for thousands of years became impossible to perform because the people who knew how to perform them were gone. Songlines that had connected communities across the continent fell silent because the communities through whose country they passed had been too devastated to maintain them. The living library of 50,000 years of accumulated human knowledge was burning, and disease was only one of the forces at work. There was also direct violence. The settlers needed land for their sheep and cattle and farms. The Aboriginal people were on that land. And the settlers' solution to this problem across much of the continent and across much of the 19th century was to kill the people who were in the way. The frontier massacres of the 19th century in Australia are only now being systematically documented. For a long time, Australian public history preferred to look away from this part of the record. The Colonial Frontier Massacres Map, a research project based at the University of Newcastle and led by Professor Lyndall Ryan, has documented more than 400 massacres of Aboriginal people between 1788 and 1930. 400. In most cases, these were attacks by settlers or by police or by military forces on Aboriginal communities, killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. The death toll from frontier violence is not fully known, but conservative estimates suggest it was in the tens of thousands. There were also the policies, the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, the practice now known as the stolen generations, which operated across much of the 20th century and in some areas well before that. Children were taken from their communities and placed in institutions or with non-Aboriginal families, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultures, and were instead trained for a life of domestic or agricultural service. The explicit purpose of these policies was, in the words of those who administered them, to absorb or to assimilate Aboriginal people into the broader Australian population, to make them disappear as a distinct people. This was attempted cultural genocide, not genocide in the sense of mass physical killing, though that also happened, but genocide in the sense defined by the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which includes the deliberate transfer of children of a group to another group, with the intent to destroy the group as such. And yet the Aboriginal peoples of Australia survived. They are still here. Their cultures are damaged, some beyond recovery, but not destroyed. Their languages, many gone but not all. Their knowledge much lost but not entirely. Their communities devastated but not eliminated. Their connection to their land disrupted and in many cases severed but not completely broken. This survival is itself remarkable. It represents a resilience that should be understood in the context of the 65,000 years that preceded it. A people who had survived ice ages and megafauna extinctions and dramatic climate change and the flooding of their coastal lands and everything else that 50,000 years of history can throw at a civilization did not simply disappear because the British arrived with guns and diseases. They adapted as they had always adapted. They found ways to maintain what could be maintained. They held on to what could be held. And they began, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a process of cultural recovery and assertion that is still ongoing. The last few decades have seen significant changes in how Aboriginal history and culture are understood and valued in Australia and globally. The 1967 referendum, in which Australians voted overwhelmingly to include Aboriginal people in the census and to allow the Commonwealth to make laws for them, was a landmark moment in the recognition of Aboriginal citizenship, though it came with its own complications. The land rights movement of the 1970s and 1980s, the Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court of Australia recognised the doctrine of native title and rejected the fiction of terra nullius, the formal apology by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008 to the stolen generations. These are significant moments in a process of recognition and reconciliation that is far from complete but is genuinely underway. In the academic world, the revolution in understanding Aboriginal Australian prehistory is still unfolding. New archaeological discoveries continue to push back the dates of human activity in Australia. New analytical techniques are revealing new dimensions of the knowledge encoded in oral traditions. New collaborations between researchers and Aboriginal communities are producing insights that neither could produce alone. The 50,000 years that were lost, the great gap in human history that this story began by naming, is being slowly, partially, incompletely, but genuinely recovered. What is emerging from this recovery is a picture of extraordinary richness and complexity, a civilization that deserves to be counted among the great human achievements, and not despite its differences from the civilizations of Europe and Asia and the Americas, but because of them. Because it found different solutions to different problems in a different landscape across a different time scale. Because it built in knowledge and practice and landscape management and cultural memory, things that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. Because it lasted in recognizable continuous form for 50,000 years. No other human civilization has done that. Not the Egyptians, not the Chinese, not the Greeks or the Romans or the Mesopotamians. No one. There is a site in the Northern Territory of Australia called Majed Bebe. It is a rock shelter, a shallow cave in the Arnhem Land Escarpment, overhung by sandstone and surrounded by the tropical woodland of the Northern Territory. It is not dramatic looking. You could walk past it without giving it a second glance. But Majid Bebe is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The layers of sediment in Majid Bebe's floor contain human artifacts that have been dated to at least 65,000 years ago. Ground edge axes, ochre processing equipment, reflective pieces of mica and other minerals that appear to have been used for decoration. The traces of human activity at this site begin 65,000 years ago and continue without significant interruption to the present day. The traditional owners of the site, the Mirarr people, have been connected to it across that entire period, or at least across as much of it as we can trace. 65,000 years, one site, one people. One continuous thread of human habitation reaching back to a time before any other human culture on Earth had reached the level of complexity required to cross an ocean. When you stand at a site like Majid Bebe and try to hold in your mind the depth of time that the stones and the sediment represent, it produces a kind of conceptual vertigo. The human mind is not designed to intuitively grasp numbers like 65,000 years. We can say the words, we can write the number, but to actually feel what 65,000 years means in human terms, to imagine the generations upon generations upon generations of people who sheltered in that rock overhang, who processed their ochre on that stone, who looked out at that same escarpment landscape and told their children stories about the ancestral beings who created it, is a genuine challenge. And yet the attempt is worth making. Because only by genuinely grappling with that depth of time can we begin to understand what was lost and what survived and what the recovery and recognition of Aboriginal Australian history means, not just for Australia, but for the entire human story. Let us talk about what this story means for our understanding of human nature and human possibility, because that is ultimately the deepest significance of the 50,000 years. One of the persistent myths about human civilization is that it follows a single trajectory, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from prehistoric to historical. This trajectory narrative assumes that all human cultures are, in essence, trying to reach the same destination by the same path, and that the cultures that built pyramids and cities and empires and writing systems were simply further along the road than cultures that did not build these things. The cultures that did not build these things were behind. They were earlier, less developed, more primitive. The story of Aboriginal Australia breaks this narrative completely, not because Aboriginal culture was trying to reach the same destination and failed, but because it was pursuing a different set of goals, developing different kinds of knowledge and complexity, building different things, and it was doing so with extraordinary success across an extraordinarily long period of time. A civilization that maintains continuous presence on a continent for 65,000 years, while that continent's climate shifts dramatically, while its megafauna goes extinct, while its coastlines change shape, while periodic droughts and floods test the resilience of its knowledge systems and social structures. A civilization that survives all of that is not a failure. It is not a primitive stage on the way to something better. It is a genuinely remarkable achievement of human intelligence, adaptability, and cultural continuity. The things that Aboriginal Australian culture built, it built in ways that left no stone monuments. It builds them in knowledge, in practice, in social structure, in relationship with the land. And those things, precisely because they are not made of stone, were far more vulnerable to the disruptions of colonization than any pyramid or palace wall. When the people died and were removed and their children were taken and their languages were forbidden, the civilizational achievements that had taken 50,000 years to accumulate began to vanish at catastrophic speed, but not completely. And that is important to hold on to, not completely. The languages that survive carry within them ways of knowing the world that are genuinely different from anything available in any European intellectual tradition. The ecological knowledge that has been preserved and is being recovered and applied to contemporary land management challenges is producing real results. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Aboriginal traditions is being recognized and studied by professional astronomers. The cultural practices of ceremony and song and story that connect people to their country and to each other are being practiced, maintained, and passed on. And the archaeological and historical research that is recovering the depth of the 50,000 years is itself a form of cultural recovery. Every time a researcher publishes a paper confirming that ground edge axe technology in Australia dates to 49,000 years ago, or that seed grinding technology was practiced in Australia 30,000 years ago, or that the oral traditions of a particular Aboriginal community appear to preserve memories of events that happened 12,000 years before Europeans arrived in Australia, they are adding to the account. They are restoring something to the record that was taken away. The recovery of Aboriginal Australian history is not just an Australian story, it is a human story. It is part of the larger project of understanding who we are and where we came from, and what we have been capable of across the full depth of our time on Earth. And Australia's role in that story is unique and irreplaceable because nowhere else on Earth do we have access to 65,000 years of continuous human cultural history. Nowhere else has a single people maintained their presence in their country across that span of time. Nowhere else has a living culture preserved within itself memories and knowledge that extend so far back into human prehistory. This is the archive that the 50,000 years contains, not in stone, not on paper, not in any medium that the standard definitions of historical record recognize, but in living culture, in oral tradition, in relationship with country, in the accumulated knowledge of tens of thousands of generations of people who knew their land better than anyone has ever known anything. It is an archive that has been damaged, partially destroyed, parts of it lost beyond recovery. But it is also an archive that is still alive, still being maintained, still being added to, still capable of teaching us things about human history and human nature and human possibility that we cannot learn anywhere else. That is the significance of the 50,000 years. That is why the gap in human history is not just an Australian story. It is a story about all of us, about what humans are capable of, about the diversity of the paths that our species has taken, about the richness that has already been lost, and the richness that still remains to be recovered and understood and valued. The story that began 65,000 years ago on the northern shores of a continent has not ended. It is still being told by the people who carry it, by the researchers who are working to understand it, by the landscape itself, which still holds within it the traces of all those thousands of years of human presence and management and care. And it is a story worth knowing, not as a historical curiosity, not as a sad chapter in the record of colonial destruction, but as one of the genuinely great chapters in the history of the human species. A chapter that most of the world has not yet read, but that is waiting to be discovered. 65,000 years, the oldest story in the world, and we are only just beginning to listen. Now, let us return to the beginning of this story, because there is a thread we have not fully followed, and it leads somewhere remarkable. When the first people arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago, they did not arrive into a vacuum. They arrived into a world that already had other inhabitants, including, in some accounts and interpretations, the possibility of other hominin species. This is a genuinely contested area of research, and the evidence is not definitive. But it is worth examining because it touches on one of the most profound questions in human prehistory. By the time modern humans were leaving Africa and spreading across Eurasia and eventually reaching Australia, the world was not yet inhabited exclusively by Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were still living across Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans, a mysterious hominin species known primarily from DNA extracted from a fragment of finger bone found in Siberia, were present across a vast swathe of Asia, and there were possibly other, less well understood hominin populations in parts of Southeast Asia. When modern humans spread out of Africa, they interbred with the Neanderthals. The evidence for this is now conclusive. Modern non-African humans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, inherited from these ancient encounters. And modern humans also interbred with Denisovans. The evidence for this is also solid. People of Australasian ancestry, which includes Aboriginal Australians and people from New Guinea and some Pacific Island populations, carry a higher proportion of Denisovan DNA than any other modern human population. Between 4 and 6% of the genome of some Aboriginal Australian individuals shows Denisovan ancestry. This is extraordinary. It means that among the most distinctive genetic legacies of the Denisovans on Earth today, the strongest signal is found in Aboriginal Australians, the people who made that first ocean crossing 65,000 years ago were already carrying within them the genetic heritage of an encounter between their ancestors and a different hominin species. They were, in a genetic sense, the product of multiple lineages of ancient humanity. And there is the additional possibility, still debated, that there may have been other hominin populations already present in Australia or the greater Sahul landmass when modern humans arrived. Populations whose existence we have not yet confirmed from the physical evidence, but whose possible presence is suggested by some unusual morphological features in early Australian fossil remains. The Mungo Man, discovered at Lake Mungo in New South Wales in 1974 and dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, displays a gracile, slender anatomy. But other early Australian fossil remains found at sites like Cow Swamp display a much more robust anatomy with prominent brow ridges and other features that some researchers have interpreted as representing a different population, possibly with archaic characteristics derived from an earlier wave of human or near-human migration to the region. The debate over these remains is complex and involves both scientific and political dimensions. Aboriginal Australians have strongly objected to the treatment of their ancestors' remains by researchers, and many of the remains that were the subject of scientific analysis in the 20th century have since been repatriated for reburial by Aboriginal communities. The scientific questions about early Australian population history therefore overlap with questions of cultural respect and community rights in ways that complicate a straightforward archaeological narrative. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the earliest human population of Australia was not a simple, uniform group of migrants. They were diverse, they were genetically complex, they were the product of multiple human lineages that had interacted and interbred across the long passage from Africa through the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia. And once they were in Australia, isolated from the rest of the world by ocean, they developed in their own ways, adapting to their own landscape, building their own culture, becoming something that was both continuous with the broader human story and distinctively themselves. There is an aspect of the Australian story that connects it to what is increasingly being recognized as a global pattern of historical erasure. The story of what happened to Aboriginal Australians during the colonial period is, in its broad outlines, similar to what happened to Indigenous peoples across the Americas, across Africa, across Asia, wherever European colonialism reached. The mechanisms were similar: disease and violence and dispossession and cultural suppression. The justifications were similar: the ideology of civilization and primitiveness. The outcomes were similar: catastrophic population loss, cultural destruction, enforced assimilation. And the intellectual framework that enabled all of this was similar: a framework that divided humanity into the civilized and the primitive, that defined civilization in terms of the specific cultural forms developed in Europe, and that measured all other cultures against that standard and found them wanting. Not because they were actually simpler or less sophisticated, but because they were different in ways that the framework was not designed to recognize or value. The recovery of Aboriginal Australian history is part of a global process of dismantling this framework, of recognizing that human cultural diversity is not a hierarchy of development, but a range of different responses to different problems in different environments over different timescales. That there is no single path to civilization, no single definition of what civilization means, no single way of measuring human achievement that is universally applicable. Australia's 50,000 years offer perhaps the most dramatic single case for this reorientation. Because here, in the record of one people on one continent, we have evidence of something that the old framework was not capable of seeing: a civilization of enormous sophistication and extraordinary longevity, that built its achievements not in stone, but in knowledge, not in monuments, but in relationships with the land, not in written records, but in the living memory of a people. And now let us talk about one more dimension of this story that is only beginning to be appreciated in the broader world: the dimension of what Aboriginal Australian knowledge can offer to the challenges of our own time. The climate crisis is real. The ecological crisis is real. The world that industrial civilization has built is facing consequences of its own making that are genuinely frightening. Consequences related to exactly the kinds of things that Aboriginal Australian knowledge has been concerned with for 50,000 years. The relationship between human beings and their land, the management of fire and fire-prone landscapes, the maintenance of biological diversity, the sustainable use of ecological resources, the reading of landscape and weather, and seasonal patterns. Aboriginal Australian fire management is now being seriously applied to real land management problems across Australia. After the catastrophic 2019 and 2020 bushfire season, which burned approximately 18 million hectares of land, killed an estimated 3 billion animals, destroyed thousands of homes, and blanketed major cities in smoke for weeks, there has been a renewed and urgent interest in traditional fire management practices. Aboriginal fire practitioners have been working with government land managers and conservation organisations to apply the principles of fire stick farming to contemporary landscapes, and the results in the areas where it has been tried have been impressive. Traditional fire management produces a mosaic of burned and unburned areas at different stages of recovery. This mosaic supports far greater biodiversity than either the unbroken dense vegetation that builds up when fire is suppressed, or the catastrophically burned landscapes that result from uncontrolled megafires. It also maintains the lower fuel loads that prevent the kind of cataclysmic fire events that have become increasingly common in Australia and around the world, as climate change drives hotter, drier conditions. This is knowledge that was developed over 50,000 years of observation and practice in the Australian landscape. It is knowledge that was suppressed by colonization and that is now, literally, helping to save what remains of that landscape's ecological integrity. The wisdom of 65,000 years of living with Australian fire is not just historically interesting, it is practically urgent. The same is true in different ways of Aboriginal ecological knowledge more broadly. Detailed knowledge of the distributions, habits, and seasonal patterns of hundreds of plant and animal species. Knowledge of which water sources are reliable in different conditions. Knowledge of how to read the landscape for signs of underground water, of seasonal food availability, of ecological change. Much of this knowledge has been lost, but what remains and what is being recovered through collaborative work between researchers and Aboriginal knowledge holders is being recognized as increasingly valuable for conservation biology, for ecosystem management, for the long-term challenge of living sustainably in the Australian landscape. There is also the matter of plant knowledge. Aboriginal Australians had, over 50,000 years, developed extraordinarily detailed knowledge of the plants of their country. Which ones were edible, which ones were toxic, which ones were edible only after specific preparation, which ones had medicinal properties, which ones were useful for making tools or baskets or rope. This pharmacological and nutritional knowledge, accumulated over 50 millennia, is a resource of potentially enormous value for modern medicine and food science. Ethnobotanists working with Aboriginal communities and with the historical records of early researchers have identified numerous plant species used by Aboriginal Australians for specific medical purposes that contain compounds of potential pharmaceutical interest. This is not a simple matter of taking knowledge from one culture and commercializing it for the benefit of another. Questions of intellectual property, benefit sharing, community consent, and cultural respect are central and complex. But the point is that the knowledge exists, that it was developed over an extraordinary period of time through a systematic empirical engagement with the plant world of a specific continent, and that its value extends beyond the historical record into practical contemporary relevance. Let us come now toward something like a conclusion. Though the story we have been telling is not a story that has a conclusion in any simple sense. It is ongoing, it is still being discovered, still being recovered, still being told and retold as new evidence emerges and new perspectives are brought to bear. What happened during Australia's 50,000 years? In the most fundamental sense, what happened was this. Human beings arrived on a continent and they learned it. Over 50,000 years, they learned everything about it that could be learned by sustained, intelligent, attentive engagement. They learned its ecology and its seasonality and its weather and its geology and its biology and its astronomical alignment and its fire behavior and its water systems and its soils and its plants and its animals. They encoded that learning in a culture of extraordinary richness and complexity. They adapted to changes in the landscape and the climate that would have defeated any culture without their depth of knowledge. They built a civilization that lasted in continuous recognizable form for longer than any other human civilization in history. And then, in a few catastrophic decades, most of that civilization was shattered by the arrival of a different kind of human culture, one that had tremendous technical and military power and was backed by several centuries of accumulated global domination. but that had a fraction of the ecological wisdom and cultural depth of the people whose land it was claiming. The 50,000 years did not simply vanish, they left traces in the landscape shaped by tens of thousands of years of fire management. In the sky, where the astronomical knowledge of 65,000 years of observation is preserved in the dark constellations. In the stories that survived, carrying within the memories of events that happened before any other culture on Earth had a written word. In the languages that survived, carrying within them ways of knowing and categorizing the world that are different from anything in the European intellectual tradition. In the people who survived, carrying within them the genetic legacy of all those generations and the cultural legacy of what could be preserved and transmitted in the worst of circumstances. The story of what really happened during Australia's 50,000 years is not a story of nothing. It is not a story of stasis and simplicity and absence of achievement. It is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of the human species. It is a story of arrival and adaptation and learning and building and surviving and persisting across a depth of time that dwarfs any other human cultural tradition. And it is a story that is worth knowing. Worth knowing not because it is Australian, not because it is about Aboriginal people specifically, but because it is about what humans are capable of, about the diversity of human intelligence and human achievement, about the many different ways that a species with the cognitive capacities of Homo sapiens can engage with the world it finds itself in and build something meaningful from that engagement. The lost 50,000 years were not really lost. They were here all along, waiting in the red dirt and the rock shelters and the dark constellations and the living memories of the people who lived them, and they are being found again, slowly, incompletely, but genuinely. That finding is one of the great intellectual adventures of our time. And the story it is revealing, the true story of what happened in Australia across 65,000 years of continuous human civilization, is more extraordinary than any story that was told in its place. The silence of 50,000 years is beginning to speak, and what it is saying changes everything we thought we knew about the human past. Listen carefully, because this story has been waiting a very long time to be heard. In the northern reaches of the continent, where the monsoon comes crashing in every wet season with a power that transforms the landscape in a matter of weeks, there are rock shelters that have been visited by human beings continuously for longer than any temple or palace or library anywhere else on Earth. The paintings on their walls are layered like geological strata, image upon image upon image, the visual accumulation of tens of thousands of years of human presence. In some places, you can see a recent painting overlying an older one, and beneath that older one another older still, and beneath that, if the conditions have been right, the traces of images that were made when the sea was 100 kilometers further away than it is today. These shelters are not ruins. They are not abandoned relics of a vanished civilization. They are still visited. They are still sung to. They are still cared for by the traditional custodians who have maintained that relationship across all those thousands of years. The connection between a people and their sacred places, that connection is one of the things that survived the catastrophe of colonization, battered and in many places broken, but not entirely severed. And in those shelters, in the layers of paint and charcoal and ochre, there is encoded a history that no written record can match for depth. A history of encounters with animals now extinct, of changes in the landscape, of ceremonial practices that evolved and adapted over millennia, of the slow accretion of meaning onto a place across time. Archaeologists who work in these sites describe an experience of temporal vertigo when they look at those layered walls. The feeling of standing at the edge of a depth of time that the mind cannot fully encompass. The 65,000 years of the Australian story written in pigment on stone. What those walls contain is not decorative. It is not naive. It is not the work of people who had not yet developed the capacity for abstract thought or symbolic expression. Every figure on those walls was placed there with intention, with knowledge, with a purpose that connected the individual painter to something much larger than themselves. The ancestral beings depicted in the art are not fictional characters. They are real in the way that the most important things a culture recognizes as real are real. They are the living foundations of a world that has meaning and structure and ongoing significance. And the people who painted those walls, who visited those sites over all those thousands of years, who maintained the songs and the stories and the ceremonies that connected them to the ancestral world encoded in the rock. Those people were engaged in an act of civilization. Not the kind of civilization that builds cathedrals or compiles legal codes or calculates the trajectories of planets, but civilization in the sense of the organized, intentional, collective effort to build and maintain something larger and more enduring than any individual life. Civilization in the sense of the attempt to find meaning in the world and to transmit that meaning across generations. That attempt, made by 65,000 years of people in one of the remotest and most demanding environments on Earth, deserves to be recognized for what it is. One of the great achievements of the human species. One of the stories that defines what it means to be human. The 50,000 years are not lost. They are here, and they matter. They matter to us all. There is a concept in Aboriginal Australian philosophy that has no precise equivalent in any European language. The word is often translated as country, but country in this sense means something far more than a piece of land or a geographic territory. Country is a living entity. It breathes, it has moods, it responds to the actions of the people who are responsible for it. It can be healthy or sick. It can be cared for or neglected. It has memory. And it has, in some traditions, something like agency, something like intention. This understanding of country is not metaphorical. It is not a poetic way of expressing an emotional attachment to landscape. It is within the framework of Aboriginal Australian cosmology, a description of how the world actually works. The land is not a passive substrate upon which human history unfolds. It is an active participant in that history. The relationship between a community and its country is one of mutual dependency and mutual responsibility. The people care for the country sustains the people. Neither can flourish without the other. This relational understanding of the human-land connection has profound implications for how people behave toward their environment. If the land is alive and responsive, if it has memory and can be harmed or healed by human action, then the kind of purely extractive relationship with natural resources that characterizes industrial capitalism is not just ecologically unsustainable, it is morally wrong. It is a violation of a fundamental relationship. It is a form of desecration. For 50,000 years, this understanding of the human relationship with country shaped the way Aboriginal Australians lived on and with their land. The practices that resulted, the fire management, the sustainable harvesting, the careful management of animal and plant populations, the deep knowledge of ecological processes, were not just techniques for extracting resources without depleting them. They were expressions of a fundamental ethical commitment to country, a commitment to maintaining the health and integrity of the living world that sustained the community. This is a model of human-environment relations that is genuinely different from the models that have dominated European thinking about nature and resources. And it is a model that is beginning to attract serious attention from ecologists, environmental philosophers, and sustainability researchers who are looking for alternatives to the extractive instrumental approach to nature that has produced the ecological crisis of the present day. Aboriginal Australian land management is not a simple recipe that can be lifted from its cultural context and applied mechanically to contemporary environmental problems. It is embedded in a whole cosmological framework, in specific relationships to specific places, in ceremonies and obligations and knowledge systems that took 50,000 years to develop. But the underlying principles, the recognition of the land as a living entity with which humans exist in relationship, the emphasis on reciprocity and responsibility rather than extraction, the integration of ecological knowledge with social and spiritual obligation. These principles are ones that the contemporary world urgently needs to understand. There are researchers and land managers in Australia who are working in genuine partnership with Aboriginal communities to understand and apply these principles to contemporary ecological challenges. The results in terms of biodiversity, fire management, water quality, and the health of ecosystems are consistently impressive. Country that is cared for in the old way, or something approaching the old way, is healthier than country that has been managed according to the extractive logic of industrial agriculture and resource management. This is not a romantic fantasy about a perfect pre-contact world. Aboriginal Australia was not Eden. People made mistakes. Local extinctions happened. Climate stress produced hardship and sometimes conflict. The 50,000 years were not uniformly peaceful or ecologically perfect, but the overall trajectory of Aboriginal management of the Australian environment across those 50,000 years was one of sustainable relationship. The land was still rich, still biologically diverse, still functioning as a complex ecological system when Europeans arrived. That fact, after 65,000 years of human occupation, is itself the most powerful testimony to the validity of the land management philosophy that produced it. Compare that to 250 years of European-style land management in Australia. 250 years that have produced widespread soil degradation, water salinity, the extinction of dozens of species, the transformation of vast areas of the continent into degraded pasture lands, and the catastrophic fire seasons that are becoming increasingly frequent and severe as climate change amplifies the instability that European land management has already created. 250 years versus 65,000. The comparison is not comfortable for anyone raised to believe in the self-evident superiority of European civilization. The loss of what Aboriginal Australia knew and practiced is not just a cultural tragedy for Aboriginal people. It is an ecological tragedy for the entire continent and, given Australia's role in global biodiversity, for the planet. The knowledge that was suppressed and destroyed and forgotten during 2 centuries of colonization was knowledge about how to live on this particular piece of the earth without destroying it. That knowledge is still partially available in the people and communities who maintained it through the worst of the colonial period. but recovering and applying it is a matter of some urgency. Let us now go back in time once more to a period roughly 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, which corresponds to the last glacial maximum, the coldest and driest phase of the last ice age. Because this period represents one of the great challenges in the story of Australian prehistory, and the way that Aboriginal people navigated it says something profound about human resilience and ecological knowledge. During the last glacial maximum, Australia was dramatically colder and drier than it is today. The vast interior of the continent, which today supports the sparse vegetation of an arid desert, was even more extreme during this period. Sea levels were so low that the continental shelf was exposed, adding enormous amounts of land to the coastlines, but simultaneously reducing the ocean moisture that drives rainfall across the continent. Lakes that today are intermittent or completely dry were, in some cases, already drying out or had dried out entirely. The vegetation of the continent was more restricted and more sparse than at any time before or since in the period of human occupation. This was not a good time to be a human being dependent on wild resources in the Australian interior. Archaeological evidence shows a significant reduction in the occupation of the driest parts of the continent during this period. People moved, they concentrated in refugia, areas where water and food resources remained relatively reliable despite the generally harsher conditions. Coastal areas, river valleys, the margins of still functioning lake systems, but they did not disappear. And they did not simply wait passively for conditions to improve. The archaeological record of this period, while sparser than periods before and after it, still contains evidence of human activity, human technology, and human cultural life. Fire management continued, stone tool technology was maintained, and in some cases developed in new directions. Ochre use, which is one of the markers of symbolic behavior and cultural practice, continued. The people who lived through the last glacial maximum in Australia, who navigated the most extreme period of climate stress in the entire 50,000 years of human occupation of the continent, did so through the application of accumulated ecological knowledge. They knew where the water would be when conditions got extreme. They knew which plants and animals were most reliable in drought conditions. They knew how to reduce their resource demands during lean periods and where to concentrate their activities when the landscape could support fewer people. This knowledge was not improvised. It was not figured out in the moment of crisis. It was a product of generations of accumulated observation and transmitted knowledge about the Australian landscape and its behaviour under stress. The people who survived the last glacial maximum did so because their ancestors had learned from previous periods of stress and encoded that learning in the cultural traditions that the survivors inherited. This is the adaptive value of deep cultural memory. A culture with 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge about its landscape has, in effect, a very long record of how that landscape has behaved under different conditions, including conditions that are extreme and rare by human lifetime standards, but that may recur on longer cycles. A community with access to stories about what happened the last time a particular type of drought occurred, or the last time a particular water hole dried up, or the last time the fire season was exceptionally severe, has a significant advantage over a community with only a generation or two of institutional memory. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians are not just cultural treasures, they are survival manuals. They encode knowledge about how to live in the Australian landscape across the full range of conditions that the landscape can produce, including the extreme ones. And that knowledge, accumulated across 50,000 years of observation and testing and refinement, represents a depth of ecological understanding that cannot be replicated in any other way. This is why the loss of so much of that knowledge through the colonial period is not just a cultural tragedy, but a practical one. It is a loss of hard-won information about how to live sustainably in one of the most challenging and variable environments on Earth. Some of that information has been recovered and is being applied, but much of it has gone beyond recovery, lost with the last speakers of languages that are now extinct, lost with the elders who died before their knowledge could be transmitted, lost in the disruption of cultural practices that were the vehicle for that transmission. What remains is still extraordinary and still valuable. But the awareness of what has been lost should produce not just sadness, but urgency. The knowledge that still exists in the communities and people and practices that survived needs to be recognized, supported, and given the conditions it needs to continue. Let us think for a moment about the children who grew up in Aboriginal communities across those 50,000 years, what their childhoods were like, what they learned and how they learned it. Because education, in the sense of the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, was central to everything that made that 50,000 year civilization function. Aboriginal children in traditional communities did not go to school. They did not sit in classrooms and learn from books or tablets, but they were, from the earliest age, immersed in a comprehensive educational environment. Everything around them was teaching them something. The adults around them were continuously demonstrating knowledge and skill, not in formal lessons, but in the course of daily life. The country itself, the landscape and its features and its inhabitants was a curriculum. A child growing up in a traditional Aboriginal community would begin learning to identify and locate food plants from the time they could walk, not through formal instruction, but through accompaniment. They would go with the women when they gathered. They would watch. They would be given small tasks, small responsibilities appropriate to their age and capability. Over years of this kind of apprenticeship, they would gradually absorb an encyclopedic knowledge of the plant world of their country, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were dangerous, when and where they could be found, how to prepare them safely. By the time a young person reached adulthood, this knowledge was not just memorized. It was embodied, integrated into the skills of hand and eye and nose that allow real expertise to function automatically. The same was true of animal knowledge, of tracking, of hunting, of understanding the behavior and habits of the creatures that shared their country. Young boys would learn to track from the time they could walk, initially as a game, gradually as a real skill with real consequences. The ability to read the story of an animal's passage through the landscape from the marks it left, to understand from the depth and clarity of a print how long ago it was made, to judge from the spacing of tracks whether an animal was moving at a walk or a trot or a run, to follow a trail over hard ground where casual observation would miss it entirely. This is a form of intelligence and perception that requires years of practice to develop. It was developed in traditional communities through continuous engagement with the real world from childhood. And then there was the ceremonial education, the transmission of the deeper layers of knowledge, the sacred stories and songs and ceremonies that connected a person to the dreaming and to their responsibilities as a custodian of country. This education was more formal in the sense of being structured and controlled. Access to different levels of sacred knowledge was granted progressively through a series of initiations and ceremonies that marked the passage from childhood to different stages of adult responsibility. Some knowledge was restricted by gender, some by age and level of initiation, some by membership in specific ceremonial groups. The organization of knowledge in this way was not arbitrary. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of what kinds of knowledge required what kinds of preparation and responsibility. The system of education that functioned in Aboriginal Australian communities was, in its own way, as comprehensive and demanding as any university curriculum. It produced adults who were expert in the ecology of their country, skilled in the technologies needed to survive and thrive in that country, knowledgeable in the social and ceremonial obligations that governed their relationships with other people and with country itself, and connected to a tradition of understanding and practice that extended back into deep time. That system of education was one of the primary targets of the colonial project. Remove the children from their communities, put them in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultures, train them for domestic service, and within a generation or two, the accumulated knowledge of 50,000 years would be gone. This was the logic of the stolen generations, and it was, in many communities, devastatingly effective. The recovery of that educational system in forms appropriate to the contemporary context is one of the most important challenges facing Aboriginal communities today. How to transmit the knowledge that survives to the next generation. How to maintain the connection to country that is the foundation of that knowledge. How to honor the forms in which that knowledge was traditionally held and transmitted while also creating the conditions in which young people with smartphones and social media and the full range of pressures of contemporary life can still find meaning and identity and belonging in their connection to a tradition 65,000 years deep. These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers, but they are being worked on in communities across Australia by people who understand both the depth of what they are trying to preserve and the complexity of the world they are trying to preserve it in. Let us also spend some time with the question of conflict, because it would be a mistake to romanticize the 50,000 years as a period of unbroken peace and harmony. Human beings are human beings across all cultures and all times. Conflict happened, competition over resources, disputes between communities, violence between groups. All of these were part of the human reality of Aboriginal Australia, just as they are part of the human reality everywhere. But the nature and scale of conflict in traditional Aboriginal society is worth thinking about carefully. The weapons of traditional warfare in Australia were spears, clubs, boomerangs, shields. These are lethal weapons capable of killing, but they are weapons that require physical proximity. They are not weapons of mass destruction. Battles in traditional Aboriginal society were typically limited in their duration and casualties. There were formal protocols for conflict resolution, mechanisms for ending disputes before they escalated to the point of serious casualties. The deliberate mass killing of entire communities, the kind of genocide that has characterized so many episodes of conflict between industrial era states, was not a feature of traditional Aboriginal warfare. This is not because Aboriginal people were inherently more peaceful than other human populations. It is because the social structures and conflict resolution mechanisms that had evolved over 50,000 years of life in small communities on a shared continent were, in general, effective at managing conflict before it escalated to catastrophic levels. the songlines and the trade networks, and the ceremonial obligations that connected communities across the continent were also, among other things, mechanisms for maintaining peaceful relationships. The exchange relationships and the shared ceremonies and the intermarriage arrangements that connected communities across the continent created webs of mutual dependency and mutual obligation that made all-out warfare genuinely costly in social and ceremonial terms, not just in physical ones. This does not mean that life in traditional Aboriginal Australia was always peaceful. There were feuds, there were revenge killings, there were skirmishes over territories and resources. But the overall level of lethal violence in traditional Aboriginal society appears, from the historical and ethnographic evidence, to have been lower than in many other human societies of comparable social complexity. The mechanisms for conflict resolution were sophisticated, and they were embedded in the same cultural framework that managed everything else about community life. The arrival of Europeans destroyed many of these mechanisms, along with much else. Not just through the direct violence of colonial confrontation, but through the disruption of the social fabric that the conflict resolution mechanisms depended upon. When communities were decimated by disease, when traditional leadership structures were undermined, when the ceremonial and trade networks that connected communities were disrupted, the mechanisms for managing conflict between communities were also damaged. Some of the violence that occurred in Aboriginal communities during and after the colonial period reflects not a reversion to some natural state of savagery, as colonial observers often characterized it, but the breakdown of sophisticated social systems under catastrophic external pressure. Now, let us come to something that is, in a way, the most challenging aspect of the 50,000 years to convey. The way that time itself worked within Aboriginal Australian cosmology. The way that the deep past was not experienced as distant and separate, but as present and accessible. The way that the dreaming was not just a creation story, but an ongoing reality. In Western thinking, time is typically understood as linear. It flows in one direction, from past through present into future. The past is behind us, inaccessible except through memory and record. The future is ahead of us, unknown and to be determined by present actions. The present is the interface between what has been and what will be. This is a very particular way of organizing temporal experience, and it is by no means universal. Aboriginal Australian temporal understanding is different in ways that are genuinely difficult to translate into Western conceptual frameworks. The dreaming, the time of creation, the time when the ancestral beings moved through the world, singing things into existence, is not simply past. It is not a remote historical period that happened once and is now over and done. The dreaming is still happening. The ancestral beings who created the landscape are still present in it. Their actions are still unfolding in the ceremonial practices that reenact and maintain them. The sacred sites where those actions happened are still active, still charged with the presence and power of the ancestral beings associated with them. This means that the relationship between a living person and the dreaming is not the relationship between a person and a historical record. It is not like the relationship between a Christian and the historical events described in the Bible. It is more like the relationship between a node and the network it is part of. The living person is a point of connection in a web of relationships that includes the ancestral beings, the country, the other members of the community, the dead who have gone before, and the unborn who will come after. All of these relationships are ongoing. all of them carry responsibilities, and all of them are mediated through the practices, the ceremonies, the songs, the stories that constitute the living culture. This temporal framework has practical consequences. It means that the knowledge preserved in the dreaming, the knowledge encoded in the stories of ancestral beings moving through the landscape, is not experienced as knowledge about the past. It is experienced as knowledge about how things are, how they have always been, how they will continue to be. It is not historical information, but cosmological understanding, and it is continuously relevant to present day living in a way that a purely historical narrative is not. It also means that the obligation to maintain the practices that keep the dreaming alive is not a matter of cultural preservation in the sense of maintaining a museum exhibit. It is a matter of cosmic responsibility. If the ceremonies are not performed, if the songs are not sung, if the sacred sites are not cared for, the ancestral beings whose presence they maintain are diminished, and the landscape that those ancestral beings created and sustain is harmed. The world itself depends on the continuing performance of cultural practices. This is why the disruption of those practices through colonization was experienced not just as cultural loss, but as something closer to an existential threat. This temporal and cosmological framework produced a relationship with time that was, in important respects, more stable and enduring than the linear, progress-oriented temporal framework of modern Western civilization. In the Western framework, the past is constantly receding, becoming more remote, less relevant. The future is constantly approaching, promising change and improvement. The present is a transitional moment between what was and what will be. This framework has enormous advantages in terms of motivation for change and innovation, but it has corresponding disadvantages in terms of stability and continuity. A civilization oriented entirely toward progress, and the future can lose its connection to the accumulated wisdom of the past very quickly. Each generation starts almost from scratch, reinventing wheels that previous generations had already invented, forgetting lessons that previous generations had learned the hard way. The Aboriginal Australian temporal framework worked in the opposite direction. The dreaming was permanent, always accessible, always relevant. The past was not receding, but present. The obligation to maintain continuity with that past was built into the most fundamental cosmological understanding of how the world worked. This made Aboriginal culture extraordinarily resistant to change, in the sense that its core structures and values were deeply embedded in a framework that defined those structures and values as cosmologically necessary rather than merely culturally preferred. This rigidity had its own costs. It could make it difficult for the culture to adapt rapidly to genuinely novel circumstances, like the arrival of European colonizers with guns and horses and diseases against which no traditional knowledge offered any protection. But it had the immense advantage of producing a civilization that lasted in recognizable continuous form for longer than any other in human history. The very qualities that made it inflexible in the face of the colonial onslaught were the qualities that had allowed it to persist for 65,000 years before that onslaught arrived. The intersection of the Aboriginal Australian temporal framework with the Western temporal framework in the context of colonization was catastrophic. Two cosmologies that were, in fundamental respects, incompatible with each other were brought into violent contact. The Western framework, backed by military and technological power, imposed itself on the Aboriginal framework with devastating effect. But the Aboriginal framework did not simply disappear. It persisted in damaged and disrupted form in the communities that survived. And it continues to inform the way that Aboriginal Australians understand their relationship to their country, their culture, and their history. The recovery of Aboriginal Australian culture is not, therefore, simply a matter of reviving historical practices or preserving linguistic records. It is, at a deeper level, a matter of re-establishing and strengthening a particular way of being in the world, a particular relationship between people and country and time that has no equivalent anywhere else in the human story. Consider finally something that we have touched on at various points in this story but not yet examined directly. The question of what the 50,000 years tells us about human intelligence, about the nature of the mind that our species has developed, what it is capable of when it is given the right conditions. One of the oldest and most persistent intellectual errors about human cognition is the belief that intelligence is primarily a matter of formal technological achievement, that the smartest human beings are the ones who built the most impressive machines, wrote the most complex systems of law, developed the most sophisticated mathematical notation. By this measure, the Aboriginal Australians of 50,000 years ago were cognitively inferior to the Europeans who eventually colonized their continent. They had simpler tools, no writing, no formal mathematics, no cities. This measure of intelligence is wrong. It confuses the products of intelligence with intelligence itself. It mistakes the specific cultural forms that European civilization developed in its specific historical context, with the generic cognitive capacity that underlies all human cultural achievement regardless of its form. The cognitive capacity required to build and maintain the cultural system of Aboriginal Australia was not less than the cognitive capacity required to build and maintain European civilization. It was different. It was organized differently, directed toward different goals, producing different kinds of excellence. The mind that can navigate by the stars across open ocean without instruments, that can read the landscape for signs of water, food, and ecological change. That can hold in memory hundreds of plant species with their properties, locations, and seasonal variations. That can transmit complex knowledge accurately across hundreds of generations through oral tradition. That can construct and maintain social systems of extraordinary complexity without formal legal codes or bureaucracies. That mind is not inferior, it is differently excellent, and in some specific domains, it is genuinely superior. The ecological knowledge produced by 65,000 years of attentive observation of one landscape is, in terms of its accuracy and comprehensiveness with respect to that landscape, greater than anything that Western science has so far produced about the same landscape. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Aboriginal traditions reflects a longer and, in some respects, more systematic program of observation than the few centuries of European observational astronomy. The knowledge of plant pharmacology accumulated over 50 millennia likely contains information about the biochemical properties of Australian plants that modern chemistry has not yet discovered. This is not an argument against science. Modern science has produced knowledge and capabilities that traditional Aboriginal knowledge systems simply could not produce. And in many domains, modern scientific knowledge is more accurate and more powerful than traditional knowledge. But the relationship between modern science and traditional knowledge need not be one of simple replacement. There are domains in which traditional knowledge developed through deep time engagement with specific places and ecosystems, has things to tell modern science that modern science has not yet figured out on its own. The recovery and integration of Aboriginal Australian knowledge into contemporary understanding of the Australian environment and its management is an example of this kind of productive interaction. Where it has happened, it has produced better outcomes than either traditional knowledge or Western scientific management could produce alone. It combines the depth of temporal perspective and ecological knowledge available only from 65,000 years of continuous engagement with a landscape with the analytical power and cross-referencing capability of modern science. The combination is more powerful than either element alone. This is perhaps the most hopeful message that emerges from the story of the 50,000 years. That the knowledge developed by Aboriginal Australians across that extraordinary span of time has not only historical value but contemporary relevance. That it is not simply a monument to what has been lost, but a living resource for addressing the challenges of the present. That the recovery of Aboriginal Australian history is not just an act of justice to a people who were wronged, but an act of intelligence on the part of a civilization that is struggling with exactly the kind of ecological crisis that 65,000 years of sustainable land management might help it address. The 50,000 years are not over. They are not a closed chapter in a book that has moved on to other topics. They are still unfolding in the communities and the country and the knowledge systems and the cultural practices that survived the catastrophe of colonization. And they are being recovered slowly and incompletely but genuinely through the combined efforts of Aboriginal communities asserting their cultural sovereignty and researchers willing to take seriously what those communities know. The gap in human history that this story began by naming is being filled. Not completely, not without loss, not without the permanent damage of what was destroyed during those 2 devastating centuries of colonial suppression, but with something real, something that matters, something that changes the story of who we are and what we are capable of. Because the story of Australia's 50,000 years is, in the end, a story about all of us, about what the human mind is capable of when it engages seriously and sustainably with a specific place over a very long time, about what kinds of knowledge and understanding become possible through that engagement, about the diversity of the paths that our species has taken in its long journey through time, and the value of the different kinds of wisdom that those different paths have produced. We are all, in some sense, the inheritors of 65,000 years of Aboriginal Australian civilization, not because we share its specific cultural forms or its specific knowledge systems, but because we share the same species, the same cognitive capacities, the same fundamental human needs and hopes and fears that civilization addressed in its own way across all those thousands of years. And because the world we live in, the planet we all share, is also the world that those 65,000 years of human presence helped to shape. Australia is not a remote and irrelevant corner of the human story. It is one of the most important chapters in that story. A chapter that reveals things about human potential and human resilience and human diversity that cannot be learned from any other source. A chapter that is still being written, still being discovered, still being told. And the time to listen to it, seriously and carefully, and with the full weight of attention that it deserves, is now. There is one more dimension of the Australian story that deserves careful attention, and that is the question of what happened in the centuries immediately before European arrival. Because in the standard narrative of Australian prehistory, the period just before 1788 is often portrayed as a kind of timeless stasis, a world unchanged and unchanging. This too is wrong, and the correction of this picture reveals a continent in dynamic motion, with cultures adapting, trading, innovating, and engaging with the world in ways that are still being discovered. In the few centuries before European colonization, significant changes were underway in various parts of Australia. The Marquesan Trepang industry was bringing regular contact with Southeast Asian traders to the northern coast. New material goods, new ideas, new words were entering Aboriginal communities through these contacts. In some areas, the scale and organization of ceremonial gatherings appears to have been increasing, suggesting growing regional integration and more complex inter-community relationships. Seed processing technology was being refined and extended. The aquaculture systems of Western Victoria were still being maintained and may have been undergoing continued development. This was not a world stuck in some prehistoric moment. It was a world of living cultures responding to their circumstances and to each other in the ways that living cultures do. The Aboriginal Australia of 1788 was not the Aboriginal Australia of 40,000 BCE. It had changed, adapted, developed across all those thousands of years, not in a straight line toward any predetermined destination, but in the complex, multi-directional, locally variable way that genuine cultural evolution actually works. And then Europeans arrived, and in the space of a few generations, most of what had been built across 65,000 years was disrupted or destroyed, but not all, never all. There are communities today scattered across the continent, in remote areas and in cities, on traditional country and far from it, that maintain living connections to the 50,000 years. Communities where elders still remember the ceremonies and the songs, where the languages survive, transformed and adapted, but still carrying within them the structures and the knowledge of their ancient origins, where young people are choosing to reconnect with their heritage, to learn the old skills and the old stories, to find in the depth of their culture a source of identity and meaning and belonging that the contemporary world, for all its noise and speed and glitter, cannot provide. These communities are not relics. They are not living museums. They are people navigating the 21st century with the knowledge that they carry within them a tradition 65,000 years deep. That tradition does not make the 21st century simple or easy for them. It does not protect them from the pressures and difficulties and structural disadvantages that are the legacy of colonization, but it gives them something that very few other people in the world have: a connection to a human heritage of extraordinary depth and richness, a sense of belonging to a story that extends far back beyond any individual life or any individual community. A set of values and understandings about the relationship between people and country that are, in the current global context, more relevant than they have been for a very long time. The 50,000 years of Australian prehistory are not just a historical curiosity. They are not just a subject for academic study, though they are certainly worthy of the most serious academic attention. They are a living inheritance, damaged but not destroyed, partially lost but still partially available. They are a resource for a world that is struggling with exactly the kinds of challenges that 65,000 years of ecological knowledge might help it address. And they are a testament to the extraordinary diversity and depth of human cultural achievement, a reminder that the story of our species is far richer and stranger and more magnificent than any single cultural tradition can fully contain. This is the true story of what happened during Australia's 50,000 years. Not the silence that colonialism imposed, not the emptiness that the fiction of terra nullius claimed, but a civilization of enormous depth and complexity, built over the longest continuous period of human cultural development on Earth, preserving within its living traditions memories and knowledge and ways of being in the world that exist nowhere else. A civilization that was damaged almost beyond recognition by 2 centuries of colonial destruction, and that is now, slowly and painfully and with extraordinary resilience, beginning to tell its own story again. Listen carefully, because this is one of the great stories of our species, and it has been waiting, patient as the Redstone country, for someone to hear it properly. The stars above Australia tonight are the same stars that 65,000 years of human eyes looked up at and named and mapped and wove into stories that carried the world. The land beneath those stars still holds within it the traces of all those generations of human presence and care. And the people who are the descendants of all those generations, the people in whose blood the 50,000 years flow, are still here, still watching the stars, still knowing the country, still singing the songs that keep the world alive. That is the story of the lost 50,000 years, and it was never really lost at all. Now we must consider what this story means for the way that humanity understands its own past, because there is a profound irony at the heart of the Australian story that reaches beyond questions of colonial justice or cultural recovery. The irony is this: the civilization that colonized Australia, the civilization that declared itself the pinnacle of human achievement and organized its understanding of human history around its own development as the standard against which all other cultures were measured. That civilization had, in the very act of suppressing Aboriginal Australian culture, cut itself off from the deepest and most comprehensive archive of human experience available anywhere on Earth. European intellectual life in the 19th century was obsessed with questions of human origins and human development. Darwin had just published On the Origin of Species. Anthropologists were rushing to categorize and classify the human societies they were encountering around the world. The great museums of Europe were filling up with objects taken from colonized peoples, displayed as evidence of primitive stages in the development of civilization. Everyone was looking for the origins of humanity, trying to understand where we came from and how we got to where we were. And here was Australia, containing within it an archive of human history deeper than anything anywhere else on Earth. A civilization that had been observing the Australian landscape for longer than agriculture had existed anywhere in the world. A tradition of oral knowledge that had been preserving and transmitting information about the Australian environment for 65,000 years. A set of cultural practices that had sustained human life on a continent through ice ages and climate shifts and megafauna extinctions without destroying the ecological foundations of that life. But the intellectual framework of 19th century European anthropology was not capable of recognizing this archive for what it was. The very same ideology that justified colonization also made it impossible to see the depth and sophistication of what was being destroyed. If Aboriginal Australians were primitives at an early stage of human development, then their knowledge was primitive knowledge. Their traditions were curiosities to be collected and catalogued, not bodies of sophisticated understanding to be taken seriously and learned from. This is one of the most costly intellectual failures in the history of the modern world. Not just costly in the moral sense, though the moral cost was enormous, but costly in the practical sense. The destruction and suppression of Aboriginal Australian knowledge impoverished not just Aboriginal communities, but the entire human understanding of how to live on the Australian continent. And given that the ecological crisis now unfolding across that continent is, in significant ways, a crisis of exactly the land management questions that Aboriginal knowledge addressed for 65,000 years, the cost of that impoverishment is still being paid. The reversal of this failure, the genuine recognition of Aboriginal Australian knowledge as sophisticated, valuable, and relevant, is underway. But it is happening against the grain of 2 centuries of ingrained assumptions in a context where Aboriginal communities are still dealing with the social and economic consequences of colonization, and where the knowledge that survives is still vulnerable to being lost faster than it can be recovered and documented. Consider the remarkable speed with which some aspects of this recovery are now moving. In the field of astronomy, researchers working with Aboriginal community members have, in the last 2 decades, documented a body of astronomical knowledge that includes not just practical navigation and calendar information, but genuine scientific observations that have been independently verified. Aboriginal traditions that describe the variable nature of certain stars, the ones that appear to change in brightness, have been cross-referenced with modern astronomical databases and found to correspond to stars that do in fact vary in their brightness. The traditions were accurate. The people who developed those traditions were making real astronomical observations, recording them in a form that preserved the information across generations. In the field of geology, researchers working with Aboriginal traditions about coastal geography and the features of now submerged landscapes have used those traditions to locate areas of archaeological interest on the continental shelf. The traditions describe specific coastal features, specific landmarks, specific environmental conditions in places that are now under the sea. When researchers have investigated those areas using underwater survey techniques, they have found the remnants of the landscapes described in the traditions: hearths, stone artifacts, the remnants of human habitation dating to the time when sea levels were lower and those areas were dry land. In the field of botany, ethnobotanists working with Aboriginal knowledge holders have identified dozens of plant species used for specific purposes, many of which have been found on biochemical analysis to contain compounds consistent with the uses described in the traditional knowledge: pain relief, wound healing, fever reduction, treatments for specific conditions. The traditional pharmacopoeia of Aboriginal Australia represents tens of thousands of years of empirical investigation of the biochemical properties of Australian plants. Some of what it contains is almost certainly already known to modern pharmacology. Some of it may represent knowledge of compounds and applications that have not yet been investigated by modern science. All of this is evidence that the knowledge encoded in the 50,000 years is not merely historically interesting, but potentially practically significant. Not all of it will prove to be accurate by the standards of modern science. Some of what is preserved in oral traditions will be metaphorical rather than literal, or will reflect a specific cultural interpretation of natural phenomena rather than a universal description of those phenomena. Science and traditional knowledge are not the same thing, and conflating them entirely does neither any favors. but the evidence that genuine empirical observation and genuine ecological understanding are encoded in the surviving traditions of Aboriginal Australia is now strong enough that dismissing those traditions as mere myth or superstition is no longer intellectually defensible. They are sources of information about the Australian natural world that deserve serious attention from researchers working in the relevant fields. And this brings us finally to the question of what the recovery of the 50,000 years means for Australia as a whole, for the Australian national story, for the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, for what kind of society Australia wants to be, and what kind of story it wants to tell about itself. For most of the 250 years since European colonization, the dominant Australian national story has been one of progress, of a vast, empty, undeveloped continent being tamed and built and made productive by European settlers, of civilization being brought to a wilderness. This story required as its foundation the fiction that the continent was indeed empty and undeveloped before Europeans arrived. That the Aboriginal people who were there were so primitive as to be effectively absent from history, terra nullius in the cultural as well as the legal sense. That story is being replaced, slowly contested every step of the way by people and institutions with political or psychological investments in the old narrative, but genuinely replaced. The recognition that Australia has a history 65,000 years deep, that the land Australians live on today has been shaped by tens of thousands of years of human management, that the First Nations peoples of Australia are not a historical footnote, but the custodians of the longest continuous human civilization on Earth. This recognition is changing how Australians understand their country and themselves. It is a change that has been driven in significant part by Aboriginal Australians themselves, by the land rights movement, the Mabo decision, the apology to the stolen generations, the constitutional recognition debate, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and countless smaller acts of cultural assertion and recovery by communities across the continent. And it has been supported by researchers and journalists and educators and artists who have taken seriously the task of bringing the real depth of Aboriginal history to broader public attention. The work is far from complete. The structural inequalities that are the legacy of colonization remain profound. Aboriginal Australians, on average, die younger, suffer higher rates of poverty, imprisonment, and chronic illness, and face systemic disadvantages in education and employment that no amount of cultural recognition alone will address. The recovery of the 50,000 years is not just a story told in books and documentaries. It has to be accompanied by genuine structural change, genuine transfer of power and resources and decision-making authority. To be anything more than a feel-good narrative that leaves the underlying injustices intact. But the recovery of the historical story, the genuine recognition of the depth and complexity and achievement of the 50,000 years, is a necessary part of that larger process. Because a society that understands what Aboriginal Australian civilization actually was, what was actually destroyed during the colonial period, what actually remains, and what the recovery of that inheritance could mean for Australia and for the world, is a society that is better equipped to make the changes that genuine reconciliation requires. The 50,000 years are not just a story about the past. They are a resource for the future, a deep archive of knowledge about how to live on the Australian continent in ways that sustain rather than deplete its ecological foundations. a model of cultural resilience, of the capacity of human communities to maintain their identity and their knowledge across extraordinary spans of time and through extraordinary challenges. A demonstration that there are multiple ways to be human, multiple forms of intelligence and achievement and cultural sophistication, and that a world that takes seriously the full diversity of human civilizational achievement is richer and more capable than a world that recognizes only one tradition as valid. This is the real significance of what happened during Australia's lost 50,000 years. Not just that something was lost, but that it is being found again, and that what is being found has value, real and practical and urgent value for the world we are trying to build now. The story of 65,000 years of continuous human civilization in Australia is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire archive of human experience. It deserves to be known, it deserves to be taken seriously, and it deserves to be told with the full weight of attention and care and wonder that it merits. Because it is, in every sense that matters, one of the great stories of our kind. One final thread remains, and it is the thread that connects everything in this story to you, sitting wherever you are in the world right now, listening to a story about a place and a people that may feel very far from your own life. Here is why this story matters to you personally, regardless of where you are from or what your own cultural heritage is. Every human being alive today is descended from people who once possessed the kind of knowledge that Aboriginal Australians maintained for 65,000 years. The knowledge of specific places, the knowledge of which plants grew where and when and what they were good for, the knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal patterns, the knowledge of how to read a landscape and live within it without destroying it. At some point in your ancestral line, not so very long ago in evolutionary terms, your ancestors knew things about their specific place on Earth that you have completely forgotten. Agriculture, civilization, cities, industry, the digital world. These developments, all of which happened in a geological eye blink of the last 10 to 12,000 years, gave us extraordinary new capabilities, but they came at a cost. The cost was the loss of most of the deep, place-specific ecological knowledge that our ancestors had accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of careful, attentive presence in specific landscapes. We traded depth of local knowledge for breadth of global capability, and the exchange, while in many respects enormously beneficial, also produced the ecological crisis we are now living in. A species with the power to transform entire continents, but without the knowledge of how to live sustainably within the ecological systems that sustain all life on Earth. Aboriginal Australia is a glimpse of what we traded away. It is not a perfect model, not an Eden, not a recipe that can be copied wholesale, but it is evidence that it is possible for human beings to maintain, across an extraordinary span of time, a relationship with a specific landscape that is genuinely sustainable. That does not destroy the ecological foundations that make human life possible. That builds up knowledge rather than depleting it. That transmits understanding across generations rather than losing it. That possibility, demonstrated over 65,000 years of continuous human civilization in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, is one of the most important facts about human nature and human possibility that exists. It tells us that sustainability is not just a policy option or a technological challenge. It is something that human beings, with their particular kind of intelligence and their capacity for culture and the transmission of knowledge, are genuinely capable of. It has been done by human beings just like us, on a continent that is, in many respects, more demanding and more variable than most of the rest of the habitable world. The 50,000 years of Australia are, in this sense, a message from the past to the present. Not a message encoded in stone or bronze or paper, but in the living culture and the living land of a people who found a way to be human that lasted in recognizable form across a depth of time that no other human civilization has matched. That message is worth receiving, worth listening to carefully, worth taking seriously in all its complexity and all its difficulty and all its genuine relevance to the world we are trying to build and sustain now. The stars above Australia are ancient, the redstone is ancient, the knowledge encoded in the living culture of the first Australians is ancient beyond any other living cultural tradition on Earth. And it still has things to tell us, if we are willing finally to listen. The rock shelters of Arnhem Land hold their painted walls in the dark tonight. The emu in the sky turns slowly above the desert. Somewhere in a remote community, an elder knows a song that was first sung before the pyramids existed, before the wheel was invented, before any written word was scratched into any surface anywhere. That song is still alive, still carrying within it the knowledge and the connection and the memory of all those tens of thousands of years, still waiting to be heard by a world that is only now beginning to understand what it has almost lost and what it still has a chance to recover and honor and learn from. That is the story of Australia's 50,000 years. And it is not over. It is still being written in the red dirt and the dark constellations and the living voices of the oldest civilization on Earth. And if you are lying here in the dark, wherever in the world you are, whatever landscape is outside your window tonight, consider this one final thought before sleep takes you. The ground beneath your feet, wherever you stand on this earth, was once known intimately by people who had lived on it for thousands of years. People who knew its plants and its animals and its water and its seasons in the way that Aboriginal Australians know the Australian landscape. Most of that knowledge is gone from most of the world, but in Australia, a thread of it still survives, connected across 65,000 years to the first human beings who set foot on that continent and began the extraordinary long work of learning it. That thread is fragile, but it is alive, and the world needs it to remain so. Rest well. The oldest story in the world is still being told. The land remembers everything, even when we forget.